The coffee maker was hissing its final breath, a sound as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I was stirring a pot of oatmeal, the cinnamon swirling into a familiar pattern, when my son-in-law, Ethan, walked past. He didn't say a word, didn't even glance my way, just grabbed his mug and left for a call. In that moment, I wasn't his mother-in-law or the woman who raised his wife and was now raising his children. I was just part of the kitchen's machinery. As silent and functional as the dishwasher, it's a strange thing to become invisible in the very home you hold together. If they've ever acted like you weren't there until your absence echoed louder than presence, share your story. And if this feels like your table too, like and subscribe. My name is Helen, and for the last 5 years, my world had shrunk to the size of this house in the Charlotte suburbs. The coffee maker was hissing its final breath, a sound that had become the metronome of my mornings, while stirring a pot of oatmeal, watching the cinnamon swirl into a familiar galaxy. My son-in-law, Ethan, swept into the kitchen. He moved with an air of impatient ownership, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. He didn't say a word, didn't even glance my way as he grabbed his favorite oversized mug from the hook I always kept clear for him. In that moment, I wasn't his mother-in-law or the woman who had raised his wife. I was just part of the kitchen's machinery, as silent and functional as the dishwasher humming in the corner. My days were a seamless loop of service, a rhythm of tasks designed to keep the fragile ecosystem of this family from collapsing. I was the first one awake to pack a lunchbox for 10-year-old Sophie, the last one to sleep after folding the laundry that seemed to regenerate daily. I was the keeper of schedules, the kisser of scraped knees, the one who knew that the spare batteries were in the third drawer down. My daughter, Ava, was a phantom in her own home. Her shoulders perpetually slumped under the weight of a demanding job and a husband who offered criticism more readily than comfort. Just last week, she had come home so late that her face was gray with exhaustion. She didn't speak, just handed me her work tote and retreated to her room. Inside, I found an untouched salad and a stack of documents she needed for the next day. I put the salad in the fridge, organized the papers, and left a glass of water and 2 aspirins on her nightstand, all while she slept. She never mentioned it the next morning. It was simply expected. The tension with Ethan was a low-grade fever, a constant, thrumming frequency beneath the surface of our lives. He never thanked me, but he was quick to notice if the salt shaker wasn't in its usual spot. The children were my sanctuary. 3-year-old Noah, with his sticky jam fingers and explosive giggles, was a balm to my spirit. And then there was Sophie, my thoughtful, observant Sophie, who was beginning to see the fault lines in our family with unsettling clarity. A few nights ago, she had shown me a drawing she made. It was our family, but I was drawn in a separate corner of the page, smaller than the others, watering a plant. "That's you, Grandma," she'd said. "You're always making things grow." The innocence of it stung more than any overt cruelty could. Just last night, that unspoken contract of my role was laid bare. A piercing cry from Noah's room shattered the midnight silence. I lay still, listening, my body tense. I could hear the muffled, frustrated sounds from Ava and Ethan's room, the scrape of a chair, a sharp, whispered word. The crying intensified, turning into the kind of desperate, breathless sobs a 3-year-old summons when a nightmare has taken hold. After 5 minutes of this, I knew no one else was going to soothe him. I slipped out of bed, my feet silent on the cool floorboards, in his room. The nightlight cast long shadows. Noah was standing in his crib, tears streaming down his face, his small body trembling. Ava was by his side, looking utterly depleted, patting his back with a mechanical, exhausted rhythm. Ethan stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He looked not at his terrified son, but at his watch. I didn't ask for permission. I walked past them, lifted Noah into my arms, and held his trembling body against mine. He buried his wet face in my shoulder, his sobs beginning to subside into hiccuping gasps. I began to hum the old lullaby I used to sing for Ava, a simple, timeless tune about stars and sailboats. I swayed gently, my feet tracing a slow, familiar pattern on the rug. The tension slowly drained from his small limbs as I laid him, now breathing deeply and peacefully, back into his crib. I turned. Ethan was still in the doorway. He didn't offer a word of thanks. Instead, he looked at me, his eyes cold with annoyance. "Next time, just give him some warm milk," he said. his voice low and clipped. "There's no need for all this drama." He turned and walked away. I stood there in the semi-darkness, the ghost of the lullaby still on my lips, and felt a profound, weary sadness. To him, his son's terror was an inconvenience, and my comfort was merely drama. The first real tremor happened on a sun-drenched Saturday afternoon. Ethan's parents, Richard and Brenda, were over for one of their infrequent disruptive visits. The garage had always been my late husband Arthur's domain. His tools hung on the pegboard in a perfect, orderly silhouette, and the air still held the faint, pleasant scent of sawdust and oil. It was a space I rarely entered, a quiet memorial to his competence. Richard, a man who believed his opinions were universal truths, wandered in while I was sorting through old linens. His eyes landed on Arthur's fishing tackle box. It was a beautiful old wooden case, the cherry wood worn smooth with age, the brass latches still gleaming. Arthur had spent a whole winter crafting it. "Well, look at this," Richard boomed, his voice echoing as he picked it up with a sense of entitlement. "No one's using this. I could put it to good use." He turned and started walking toward his car with it, as if the matter was settled. Brenda, following behind him, added, "Oh, he's right. Helen, Arthur would have wanted a real fisherman to have it. It's just collecting dust." A cold, still anger rose in me, sharp and clear. I didn't say a word. I simply put down the stack of folded pillowcases, walked steadily over to him, and gently took the tackle box from his hands. My touch was light, but my grip was firm. I met his surprised, indignant gaze with a calm, unwavering look of my own, a look that said, "This is not yours to take." I then turned, my back straight, and placed the box back on its high shelf. Inside the tall metal cabinet Arthur had built to last a lifetime. It was a silent, unbreachable boundary drawn in the dusty air between us. Richard scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision, and muttered something to Brenda about sentimentality. But he didn't challenge me again. He knew he had crossed a line. The rest of their visit was thick with a tense, unspoken animosity. That evening, the real storm broke, after a tense dinner where Richard pointedly discussed his plans for a fishing trip. I was clearing the plates when Ethan leaned back in his chair, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. "So, Ava and I have some great news," he announced. "Mom and Dad are moving in with us, permanently." Brenda beamed, her eyes darting toward me with a flicker of triumph. I felt Ava flinch beside me, a tiny movement of someone bracing for a blow. Her hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. "They're getting older," Ethan continued, his voice resonating with false magnanimity. "They need our support, and of course, they'll need the guest suite." That room held memories of me rocking a newborn Sophie to sleep, of late-night talks with Ava when she was a teenager. He finally turned his gaze on me, his eyes as cool and hard as river stones. "So, we've cleared out a space for you in the garage. You can move your things tonight." To fight would have been to imply I still believed I had a place here to defend. I simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, as if accepting a change in the weather. I finished the dishes, the clinking of porcelain the only sound in the suffocating silence. Later, I walked into the garage. The air was heavy and cold, thick with the smell of gasoline and damp concrete. In the corner was a foldable cot with a single, thin blanket, and there, half hidden under a dusty tarp, was my old sedan. I hadn't driven it in years, but I had stubbornly refused to sell it. Despite Ethan's complaints, it was my escape route. I ran a hand over its dusty hood, a silent promise passing between us. That night, as I lay on the cot, the chill of the concrete floor seeping into my bones, I heard them laughing from the dining room, a full-throated, celebratory sound. I pulled the thin blanket tighter, the sound a distant, painful echo from a world I no longer belonged to. Sleep wouldn't come. A few hours later, the heavy door to the kitchen creaked open, spilling a rectangle of warm light onto the floor. It was Ava, her silhouette small and lost, holding a thick comforter. "Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt, "you'll be warmer with this." As I sat up to reach for it, a lifeline in the dark, Ethan's voice cut through the space like a whip. "Ava, what are you doing? I told you she's fine. Stop making a fuss." He stood in the doorway behind her, a dark, imposing shape. "But Ethan, it's cold out here," she pleaded. She's lucky she has a roof over her head. He snapped back. It's not a hotel. Now get back inside. Ava retreated without another word. Her shoulders slumped in that familiar gesture of defeat. The kitchen door clicked shut, and I was alone again. But something inside me had shifted. As I lay there, shivering, I thought of my own mother, and her mother before her, women who had shrunk themselves to fit into the spaces men allowed them. The chill I felt was no longer just from the concrete. It was the ice of resolve, freezing over a lifetime of quiet compromises. I wasn't just cold anymore, I was decided. The first morning in the garage was a lesson in my new, diminished reality. I woke to the sound of the main house stirring, the rumble of the shower upstairs, the distant clatter of cupboard doors. The sounds were muffled, filtered through a wall, making me feel like an eavesdropper in my own life. I had a small electric kettle and a jar of instant coffee, and I made my morning cup sitting on the edge of the cot, my feet cold on the concrete. I was no longer the center of the morning's gravity. I was a satellite, orbiting from a cold, remote distance. I watched through the small window in the garage door as Ethan's car backed out of the driveway, followed by Ava's. They left without a word, without a wave. I was already forgotten. Richard and Brenda arrived that afternoon, not with suitcases, but with an entire moving van. It was an invasion. Boxes labeled kitchen fragile and Richard's recliner were hauled inside. Brenda swept into the house like a conquering general, immediately pointing out things that needed to change. The curtains were dated, the rugs were worn, the paint color in the living room was depressing. I stayed in the garage, a silent observer to the dismantling of a home I had so carefully maintained. I heard her directing the movers, her voice sharp and authoritative. No, no, that goes in the master suite. This house has wonderful bones. It just needs a firm hand. My hand, apparently, had not been firm enough. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of quiet servitude and escalating indignities. My routine was simple. I would enter the house when they were occupied, cook the meals, clean the accumulating messes, and then retreat to my corner of the garage. Brenda had taken over the kitchen, but not the labor. She would leave lists of ingredients for me to buy specific, expensive brands I'd never purchased, and then critique the final dish. "A bit too much salt, Helen," she'd say, pushing her plate away. "And is this butter even organic?" Richard installed his enormous leather recliner directly in front of the television, where he would sit for hours, complaining about the internet speed. The house, once a place of relative order, now felt chaotic. Dirty dishes piled up in the sink, laundry baskets overflowed, and a fine layer of dust began to settle on every surface Brenda didn't deem worthy of her attention. I watched my daughter, Ava, grow more frayed each day. She was caught in an impossible position, trying to appease her overbearing in-laws while managing the silent disapproval of her husband, who saw his parents' behavior as perfectly reasonable. Sophie became my shadow, but a sad, quiet one. She would slip into the garage after school, her face drawn. One afternoon, she came to me holding her math homework, her brow furrowed in frustration. "Grandma, I don't understand these fractions," she whispered, as if afraid of being overheard. We sat together on an overturned crate, the scent of gasoline a strange backdrop to her schoolwork. I took the pencil and began to draw circles, dividing them into pieces, explaining it the way I had once explained it to Ava. A small smile touched Sophie's lips as she started to understand. It was a tiny, stolen moment of normalcy, a reminder of the bond we shared. Just then, Richard appeared at the open garage door, his large frame blocking the afternoon light. He looked at the paper, then at us, a sneer twisting his lips. "School's teaching them nonsense these days," he declared, his voice dripping with disdain. "Sophie, instead of wasting time with this, why don't you go inside and see if your Grandma Brenda needs help with dinner? Be useful." Sophie shrank back, the light in her eyes dimming. She looked from him to me, her expression lost. "Go on," he prodded. She slowly gathered her books and walked toward the house. Her shoulders slumped. Richard watched her go, then glanced at me with a look of smug satisfaction before turning away. In that moment, I felt a pain sharper than any insult directed at me. They weren't just erasing me, they were actively trying to sever the connections that held my world together. Noah, who had once been a bubbly, happy toddler, became clingy and prone to tantrums. Richard and Brenda ignored him, waving away his cries as just noise. One afternoon, Brenda decided to reorganize the kitchen. I came in to find my spices, collected over years, tossed into a box on the floor, my favorite teacup, a delicate porcelain thing with a painted bluebird that Arthur had given me for our last anniversary, was gone from its hook. I found it later, shoved to the back of a high cabinet, behind a stack of garish mugs Brenda had brought with her. I took it down, washed it carefully, and carried it back to the garage. It sat on the small crate I used as a nightstand, a tiny beacon of a life that was still mine. The breaking point wasn't a single dramatic event, but the slow, crushing weight of these moments. It was overhearing Brenda on the phone, telling a friend how they were so generous to let me stay, even though I didn't contribute. It was the memory of Richard's satisfied sneer as he drove a wedge between me and my granddaughter. It was the sight of my precious teacup, discarded like junk. I realized that in this new order, I was not just invisible, I was a liability, a ghost they were all waiting to see vanish. That night, the air in the garage felt particularly cold and suffocating. I sat on the cot and knew I could not wake up for one more day in this place. My decision made. A strange calm settled over me. This wasn't an act of anger, but of quiet, deliberate self-preservation. I pulled the old cedar chest from under the cot, the scent of wood and memory filling the cold air. Inside were my real treasures, faded photographs of Arthur and a young Ava, a bundle of his letters tied with a ribbon, my mother's wedding ring. I packed these into a small, sturdy box. Then, from a hidden compartment in the lid, I retrieved a small, heavy silver key. It was the key to the cottage in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the quiet place Arthur and I had built with our own hands. It was the key to a promise we had made that we would always have a place to go where the world couldn't touch us. I held its cold weight in my palm, a solid piece of a life I had almost forgotten. My final task was the most important. I took a small, stiff piece of cardstock and, in my clearest handwriting, wrote down the address of the cottage. No note, no explanation, just an address. I crept into the house, a shadow moving through the silent rooms. In Sophie's room, her school backpack was on her chair. I slipped the card into her pencil case, tucking it between a pink eraser and a bundle of colored pencils. It was an act of pure faith in my granddaughter's intelligence, in her observant nature, and in the unspoken bond we shared. I trusted she would know what to do with it when the time was right. Back in the garage, I packed the sedan, just the box of memories, a bag of clothes, and my bluebird teacup, wrapped carefully in a scarf. I didn't take a single thing that belonged to them. I checked the tires, wiped the thick layer of dust from the windshield. I slid into the driver's seat, the worn fabric of the chair a familiar embrace. My hand rested on the ignition key, but for a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to turn it. My gaze drifted to the dark, silent house, a hulking shape against the pre-dawn sky. And in that silence, a wave of doubt, cold and sharp, washed over me. My heart ached with a sudden, fierce pang for the children sleeping inside. Sophie, with her quiet wisdom and sad eyes, Noah, whose nightmares only I seemed to be able to chase away. Was I abandoning them? Was this an act of profound selfishness? Leaving them in a home where kindness was in such short supply, my hand trembled slightly. On the passenger seat next to me was a small, well-loved teddy bear, one I had bought for Noah at a thrift store. I had intended to sneak it onto his bed, a small comfort in my absence. I reached out and touched its soft, worn ear. But as I did, other memories flooded in, unbidden and sharp. I saw Ethan's face, cold with annoyance in the dim light of Noah's room, dismissing his son's terror as drama. I heard Richard's booming, angry voice as he berated Sophie for a simple, childish mistake, the memory of her crumpled face and tear-filled eyes making my chest tighten. I remembered Brenda's triumphant smile and Ava's look of helpless defeat. I realized then, with a clarity that cut through the guilt, that my staying would not save them. My presence had become a buffer that allowed the toxicity to flourish by absorbing the blows. I was teaching my grandchildren that this was normal by staying silent. I was teaching Sophie that a woman's worth was measured in her capacity for quiet endurance. My leaving wasn't an abandonment. It was a lesson. It was the only real protection I had left to offer them. The guilt receded, replaced by a steely resolve. With a deep breath, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered once, twice, then caught with a low, rumbling hum. It was the sound of a heart starting again. In the pre-dawn darkness, I backed slowly out of the driveway. The house was dark, its occupants asleep, oblivious to the quiet revolution taking place in their garage. I didn't look back as I turned onto the main road, heading north toward the mountains. I felt not sadness for what I was leaving, but a steady, resolute peace. I was driving toward the only place I had left to go. I was driving toward myself. The drive north was a blur of dark highways giving way to the soft, gray light of dawn. For the first hour, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my mind still replaying the scene of Ava's retreat, of the garage door clicking shut. But as the miles dissolved behind me and the first hints of the Blue Ridge Mountains appeared on the horizon like a promised land, a profound sense of peace began to settle in my bones. The engine of the old sedan hummed a steady, reliable tune, a song of liberation. I was no longer a satellite orbiting a cold star. I was my own celestial body, charting a new course. The turnoff to the cottage was almost hidden, a narrow gravel lane overgrown with ferns and wildflowers. Pine needles crunched under the tires, a sound I hadn't heard in years, a sound that whispered, "Welcome home." The cottage itself was just as I remembered, yet changed by time. It was smaller, humbler, nestled among the tall pines like a sleeping animal. The porch steps groaned under my weight, a familiar complaint. The front door was coated in a fine green layer of pollen, but the silver key, my key, slid into the lock and turned as smoothly as it had 2 decades ago. Inside, the air was thick and still, smelling of dust, old wood, and the faint, lingering scent of my husband, Arthur. Dust motes danced like fairies in the shafts of morning light that pierced through the grimy windows. A fine layer of gray covered everything, the sturdy oak table he had built, the two mismatched armchairs we'd found at a flea market, the stone fireplace that was the heart of our small home. It was neglected, forgotten, but it was mine. Every inch of this place was layered with our shared history. My first act was to throw open every window, letting the cool, pine-scented mountain air rush in. Then I began to work. I swept the floors, the rhythmic whisk of the broom a form of meditation, while clearing out the small bedroom closet. I found it Arthur's old red flannel shirt, still hanging on a hook behind the door. I lifted it down, the fabric soft and worn. I buried my face in it, and the scent of him, faint traces of sawdust, earth, and pipe tobacco rose to meet me. Suddenly, I was transported back 20 years, to a rainy Saturday when we were building this very place. The roof wasn't finished, and a cold drizzle had started. Arthur, seeing me shiver, had taken off this shirt and wrapped it around my shoulders. We had sat on the unfinished porch, drinking hot tea from a thermos, watching the rain fall on the lake, our hands clasped together, dreaming of the garden we would one day plant. The memory was so vivid, so warm, it felt more real than the cold garage I had just left. I folded the shirt carefully and placed it on the bed, a tangible piece of a love that still sheltered me. I found my bluebird teacup, miraculously intact, and washed it in the small kitchen sink. While searching for a dish towel in a dusty drawer, my fingers brushed against a leather-bound journal. It was our old gardening notebook. I pulled it out and sat at the table, flipping through the brittle, yellowed pages. Here were my sketches of the vegetable beds, Arthur's spidery handwriting noting the soil pH, a pressed wildflower tucked between the pages about perennials. It was a testament to a partnership, to the shared joy of creating something beautiful and lasting from the earth. It reminded me of who I was before I became a silent caretaker, a creator, a planner, a partner. This book wasn't just about a garden, it was about a life built on mutual respect and shared dreams. Later that afternoon, with a fire crackling merrily in the hearth, I sat down at the oak table and opened my laptop. I logged into my bank account. The numbers on the screen were a quiet affirmation. Arthur, always so careful, had left me with a small but steady pension. It wasn't a fortune, but here, it was more than enough. It was the final, invisible chain breaking. I was not dependent on Ethan's charity. I was not a burden. I was a woman of my own means. A wave of relief so profound it almost felt like joy washed over me. I was truly, finally free. That first night, I slept in a real bed for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The mattress was old and a little lumpy, but it was a world away from the cold, unforgiving cot in the garage, instead of the hum of the freezer and the smell of gasoline. My senses were filled with the sounds and scents of the forest. I could hear the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, the distant, mournful call of a loon across the lake. These were sounds of life, of a world that existed entirely outside the suffocating drama of the house I'd left behind. I lay there for hours, not sleeping but simply listening, letting the peace of the wilderness wash over me, cleansing the residue of bitterness and neglect. For the first time in years, my body felt completely at ease, my mind blissfully empty of worry. For 2 days, I existed in this bubble of peaceful solitude. I spoke only to the birds and the wind on the second afternoon. However, the landline phone, a relic I hadn't realized was still connected, jangled loudly, startling me. I hesitated, then picked it up. It was my old neighbor, Carol. Helen, there you are. I was getting worried. I saw Ava at the grocery store yesterday, and she looked like she'd seen a ghost. Is everything all right? Dear. Her cheerful, innocent query felt like a spotlight in my dark hiding place. I felt a flush of shame. Oh, Carol, it's lovely to hear your voice, I managed, my own voice sounding strained. I'm just taking a little trip, a last-minute thing. The lie felt clumsy on my tongue after a few more minutes of pleasantries. I hung up, my hand trembling slightly. The call was a stark reminder that I couldn't remain a hermit forever. The world I'd left behind still had threads connected to me. That evening, the gnawing worry for the children returned with a vengeance. I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. With a deep breath, I plugged in my cell phone. It came to life with a barrage of notifications, 3 missed calls from Ava, and a single, frantic text message sent late last night. It was longer this time. A jumble of panicked words. Mom, Noah fell trying to get cookies. Sophie's teacher called about her. She's not eating at school. Everything is a mess. I don't know what to do. My heart clenched. The words on the screen weren't just text. They were windows into a house spiraling out of control. My mind flooded with images, a chaotic montage of everything I feared. I saw the morning disaster: no coffee, no lunches, only Ethan's impatience and Ava's panic as Brenda and Richard descended the stairs like imperious guests. The scene shifted to my grandson, Noah, wailing on the floor after falling, surrounded not by comfort, but by blame and annoyance. Then I saw my daughter's face, flushed with shame as a teacher's kind voice over the phone exposed their private failure to the world. Sophie. My quiet Sophie, now a ghost at school. I could even picture the dinner that followed, a meal cooked with exhaustion and served with disdain, each bite a fresh wound to my daughter's spirit. I scrolled down and saw there was one more message, sent hours after the first, in the dead of night. It was just 4 words. They're all yelling now. Those 4 words hit me harder than the entire paragraph before them. The first message was about events, about chaos. This one was about fear. It was the sound of my daughter, a grown woman, feeling small and terrified in her own home. I closed my eyes, the phone feeling heavy in my hand. Ava's texts weren't just a cry for help. They were a confirmation of my worst fears. The void I had left wasn't empty. It was being filled with chaos, with neglect, with a casual cruelty that I had once absorbed and rendered invisible. My presence had been the dam holding back the flood, and now that the dam was gone, the waters were rising, threatening to drown the very people I loved most. The true nature of the family Ethan had built was revealing itself. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the chaos had only just begun. The days that followed were a strange mix of profound peace and a low humming anxiety. I did not reply to Ava's texts. To respond would be to re-engage, to be pulled back into the vortex of their chaos. Instead, I poured my energy into the cottage. I scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, planted a small herb garden in the window box, and spent hours on the porch, simply watching the sun move across the lake. But even in the quietest moments, my mind would drift back to the house in Charlotte. I'd see Sophie's sad, watchful eyes, hear Noah's confused cries. The worry was a constant, a dull ache beneath the surface of my newfound freedom. I was waiting, though I wasn't sure for what. A sign, perhaps, a signal that my silent act of faith had been received. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, a week after I had left. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. I was sitting on the porch steps, mending a tear in Arthur's old flannel shirt. When I heard it, the unfamiliar sound of a car engine, slow and hesitant, coming up the gravel lane. It wasn't a truck or the mail carrier's Jeep. My heart gave a sudden hard thump against my ribs. I stood up, my sewing falling into my lap, and shaded my eyes, peering through the trees. A small dark blue car, one I didn't recognize, was inching its way toward the cottage. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, as if uncertain whether to proceed or flee. The driver's side door opened, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was Ethan, but then a smaller figure emerged from the passenger side, and my breath caught in my throat. It was Sophie. Her hair was messy, her backpack was slung crookedly over one shoulder, but she stood tall, a small, determined soldier in the afternoon sun. She looked toward the cottage, her eyes searching. Then she saw me. Her face, which had been tight with worry, crumpled with relief. "Grandma," she cried, her voice carrying across the clearing, and she began to run. I moved down the steps, my legs feeling unsteady, my arms opening wide. She crashed into me with the force of a small hurricane, her arms wrapping tightly around my waist, her face burying itself in my stomach. I held her close, stroking her hair, my own eyes burning with tears. I could feel the tremors running through her small body, over her shoulder. I saw my daughter, Ava, get out of the car. She stood by the open door, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked at us, her expression a painful mix of guilt, desperation, and a flicker of something I hadn't seen in years, defiance. Our eyes met across the distance, a silent, fraught conversation passing between us. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of surrender and trust. Then, without a word, she got back in the car, reversed quickly, and drove away, leaving a small cloud of dust hanging in the air. She was gone as quickly as she had appeared. I led Sophie inside, my arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. I sat her down in one of the big armchairs by the cold fireplace and wrapped her in a thick wool blanket. Her hands were like ice. I made her a cup of hot chocolate, my hands moving with a purpose I hadn't felt in days. She drank it in small, shaky sips, her eyes darting around the small, rustic room, taking everything in. "I found it, Grandma," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "In my pencil case. I knew it was from you. I waited." She told me everything then, the words tumbling out in a rush. She spoke of the constant tension, the way Grandpa Richard's voice made her feel small, the way Grandma Brenda looked at everything with disapproval. She told me about Noah's fall and the awful fight that followed. "Mommy cried a lot," she said, her voice dropping lower. I squeezed her hand gently. "What happened in the fight? Sweet pea." "Daddy was yelling at her," Sophie recounted, her eyes fixed on the mug in her hands. He said it was all her fault, that the house was a mess, that she couldn't handle anything." Mommy tried to talk back. She said, "Ethan, that's not fair. Your parents don't help at all." But Daddy just got louder. He said, "Don't you dare blame my parents. They are guests in this house." And then Mommy said, "Please don't talk like this in front of Sophie." And he just laughed, a mean laugh. He said, "Maybe if she sees how useless her mother is, she'll learn not to be the same." Mommy didn't say anything after that. She just stood there, and then, this morning after he left, I gave her the paper, the one with the address. I told her we had to come here. I told her you would make it better. I held her hand, my heart aching for my two girls, the big one and the little one, both trapped in the same storm. We spent the rest of the day in quiet companionship. We walked by the lake, and I showed her how to skip stones across the water's surface. She, in turn, showed me the new way they were learning long division in school. We made dinner together, a simple soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, for the first time in over a week. I heard her laugh, a real, genuine laugh, as she tried to flip a sandwich in the pan. That night, she slept in the bed with Arthur's flannel shirt, curled up like a small kitten, her breathing deep and even. I sat in the armchair for a long time, watching her, the firelight dancing on her face. A fierce, protective love swelled in my chest. I had my granddaughter back, and I would not let her go. The inevitable call came 2 days later. The landline jangled, its shrill sound an intrusion on our newfound peace. I knew, with absolute certainty, who it would be. I let it ring 3 times, took a deep, steadying breath, and answered, Helen. Ethan's voice was not just angry, it was a low, controlled roar, the sound of a man whose authority had been challenged for the first time in his life. You have 60 seconds to tell me where my daughter is before I call the police and report you for kidnapping. I remained silent, letting his threat hang in the air. I walked over to the window and looked out at the lake, its surface calm and serene. Sophie was on the porch, safely out of earshot, trying to teach a chipmunk to eat from her hand. Are you listening to me? He barked, his voice rising. This is not a game. You have crossed a line. You are mentally unstable. I will tell them you are a danger to her. I will make sure you never see Sophie or Noah again. His tirade went on, a torrent of accusations and threats. He blamed me for everything, for Ava's sudden insubordination, for Sophie's disobedience, for the disruption to his perfect, well-ordered life. I listened patiently, my own anger a cold, hard stone in my stomach. I let him expend all his ammunition, let his rage crash against my silence. When he finally paused, breathless, I spoke. My voice was low, calm, and utterly devoid of the emotion he was trying so desperately to provoke. Ethan, I said, the single word cutting through his fury. Before you call your lawyer, I suggest you ask him to do a bit of research for you. What the hell are you talking about? He spat. I'm talking about the house you live in, I continued, my voice still even. The house you so generously allowed me to occupy a corner of. You seem to be under the impression that it is your house. It is not. I could hear his sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. That house, I said, savoring each word, is owned by something called the Oak Hill Family Trust. My late husband, Arthur, was a very careful, very forward-thinking man. He set it up years ago to protect his family, to protect Ava, and to protect me. The silence on the other end was now absolute. As the surviving trustee, I went on. I can tell you that your names, yours and Ava's, are on a familial lease agreement. It's a very specific document. It grants you the right to live there under certain conditions. And I believe that forcing the mother of your co-lessee and the co-founder of the trust into a garage might be considered a significant breach of those conditions, a breach that could, with 30 days' notice, terminate the agreement. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. So, by all means, call your lawyer, but tell him to look up the trust first. I'm sure he'll find it very educational. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of his stunned breathing, the power dynamic, the one he had so carefully constructed and lorded over for years, had not just shifted, it had been utterly annihilated. I heard a faint click as he hung up the phone without another word. I placed the receiver back in its cradle, my hand perfectly steady. But the moment it was done, a tremor ran through me, a violent post-adrenaline shudder. My knees felt weak, and I had to sit down heavily in the armchair. I looked out the window at Sophie, who was now giggling as the chipmunk finally took a seed from her outstretched palm, completely unaware of the war that had just been waged on her behalf. A grim, weary satisfaction settled over me, but it was mingled with a profound sense of loneliness. I had won the battle, but I had fought it alone. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling the faint, lingering scent of Arthur on the flannel shirt I wore, and wished, just for a moment, that he was here to see it. This wasn't a victory, it was a reclaiming, and the war had only just begun. The silence that followed my phone call with Ethan was more profound than any I had experienced at the cottage. For a few days, there was nothing. No calls, no texts. It was as if I had thrown a large stone into a still, dark pond and was now holding my breath, waiting for the ripples to reach my shore. The quiet was a relief, but it was also heavy with unspoken tension. I poured myself into creating a new routine with Sophie, a rhythm built on peace and simple joys, a stark contrast to the life we had both fled. We became a team of two, reclaiming the cottage and its surroundings. We cleared a small patch of earth by the porch for a garden, our hands digging into the rich, dark soil. I taught her how to tell the difference between a weed and a seedling. And she listened with a focused intensity. One afternoon while we were weeding, she looked up at me, her face smudged with dirt. "Grandma, is Mom okay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question was so direct, so full of worry, that it took my breath away. I stopped my work and sat back on my heels. Looking into her serious eyes, I chose my words carefully. "Your mother is the strongest person I know," I told her, my voice soft but firm. "Sometimes, even the strongest people need a little time to find their footing again. Like these plants, they need space and light to grow tall." She seemed to ponder this, then nodded slowly, a small understanding dawning on her face. It was in these quiet moments that I knew we weren't just hiding, we were healing. We found Arthur's old birdhouse, weathered and broken, in the shed, together, using his old tools. We carefully sanded the wood, hammered in new nails, and gave it a fresh coat of bright blue paint. The act of repairing something broken, of building something new and hopeful together, felt deeply symbolic. We baked bread, the warm, yeasty scent filling every corner of our small home, a smell of comfort and creation. In the evenings, we would sit by the fire, reading from a box of old books I had found in the attic. The haunted, watchful look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by the bright, clear curiosity of a child who feels safe. Her laughter, once a rare and precious sound, now echoed through the pines regularly. I was watching my granddaughter come back to life, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. A few days later, a large delivery truck rumbled up our quiet lane, an unexpected intrusion. The driver brought a large, brightly wrapped box to the porch. It was addressed to Sophie. My heart sank. I knew, instinctively, who it was from. We opened it together. Inside was an enormous, elaborate dollhouse, the kind that costs a small fortune, complete with tiny furniture and electric lights. The card read in Brenda's looping script, "To our precious Sophie, we miss you every day, love. Grandma Brenda and Grandpa Richard." Sophie looked at the dollhouse, then up at me, her expression not one of joy, but of deep confusion. "I don't want it," she said quietly, pushing the box away. "I just want them to be nice to Mommy." The gesture was so simple, so profound. They thought they could buy her back, that a material thing could erase the wounds they had inflicted. They didn't understand at all. That afternoon, we carefully packed the dollhouse back into its box. The next day, we drove to the nearest town and donated it to the local children's charity. Sophie herself handed it over, her face set with a quiet determination. It was her choice, her act of defiance. The second phone call from Ava came that evening. Her voice, when I answered, was different. The frantic edge was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary resolve. "Mom," she said, her voice low, "I need to tell you what happened." And so, she did. She told me that after Ethan had hung up the phone with me, he had sat in his office in complete silence. For over an hour when he emerged, his face was pale, his usual arrogance replaced by a look of disbelief. He just retreated into a stony, simmering silence. "The real change," Ava said, "came from Richard and Brenda. The next morning, they were different people." Brenda suddenly insisted on making breakfast. Richard complimented Ava on her work attire. Their fear was a palpable thing, a cloying sweetness that was more unsettling than their previous hostility. But the manipulation, Ava told me, came later. Brenda had found her alone in the kitchen and had put a hand on her arm, her voice dripping with false concern. "Ava, my dear," she had cooed, "you know we only want what's best for Ethan. He's under so much stress. Perhaps your mother, she's just a bit confused. At her age, if you spoke to her, as her daughter, perhaps you could make her see reason. We could be a happy family again. For the children." Ava said she felt a chill run down her spine. They weren't sorry. They were just trying to use her as a pawn to get their power back. Then came the tangible proof of their collective incompetence. "The power went out the other day. Mom," Ava said, her voice flat. "The bill was past due and no one noticed. You always handled those things." The power outage led to another explosive argument. Ethan had blamed her for not managing things, even though it had never been her responsibility. "He yelled that I was useless," Ava recounted, while his parents just sat there, looking at me like I was the hired help who had messed up. I listened, my heart aching for her. "Ava," I said softly, "your father always worried about Ethan's ambition. He once told me, this trust isn't just about money, Helen, it's about leverage. It's to make sure our girl always has a safe harbor, no matter what storms come." He knew, Ava, in his own way. He saw this coming. A shared, sorrowful understanding passed between us in the silence that followed. After the fight about the power, Ava continued, her voice now holding a spark of something new. After they all went to bed, I did something. Brenda had bought all this fancy, expensive coffee and put it in the front of the cupboard. I went into the kitchen, took the whole bag and poured it right down the sink. And then, Mom, I put your old simple coffee pot back on the counter where it belongs. It was a small thing, but it felt like I was taking my kitchen back. I smiled into the phone. It was more than taking back a kitchen. It was taking back a piece of herself. The walls of his carefully constructed kingdom were crumbling around him, and he had no one to blame but himself and the people he had invited inside. While Ava spoke, I looked out at Sophie, who was carefully sketching the new birdhouse in our old gardening journal. She was drawing the world as she saw it now, peaceful, full of light, a place where she could be herself, two worlds existing at the same time. One, here in the mountains, was being carefully rebuilt on a foundation of love and respect. The other, in Charlotte, was imploding under the weight of its own toxicity. But something else happened. Mom, Ava said, her voice taking on a new strength. Yesterday, Sophie sent me a video. She said it was for a school project, but I think it was for me. She described how Sophie, holding her tablet, had given her a tour of the cottage. She had pointed out the herb garden we were planting, the freshly painted birdhouse, the shelf where my bluebird teacup now sat. At the end of the short video, Sophie had turned the camera on herself. Her face was calm, her smile genuine. "I'm happy here, Mom," she had said, her voice clear and steady. "Grandma listens to me. We bake bread. It's quiet here. I can breathe." Ava paused, and I could hear her take a shaky breath. When I saw that, Mom, when I saw her face, saw her actually smiling, really happy, something inside me just broke. Or maybe it fixed itself. I realized I had been so focused on keeping my marriage from falling apart that I hadn't noticed my daughter was suffocating. I was trying to save a house that was already rotten to the core. Her voice was no longer that of a victim. It was the voice of a mother who had finally found her courage. The video hadn't just shown her Sophie's new world, it had given her the strength to start tearing down her own. The silence on the other end of the line after Ava's revelation was one of shared understanding. The roles we had played for so long, she, the overwhelmed daughter, I, the silent fixer, were dissolving. In their place, something new and fragile was beginning to grow. I didn't offer advice or solutions. I didn't say, "I told you so." The greatest gift I could give her now was not my help, but my trust. Trust in the strength I had always known she possessed, buried beneath years of fear and accommodation. We spoke for a little while longer, not about the chaos in her house, but about the simple things in mine, the color we painted the birdhouse, the funny way a squirrel kept trying to steal seeds from the feeder, the taste of the bread we had baked. It was a conversation between equals, two women finding their way. When we hung up, I felt a lightness I hadn't realized I was missing. The worry for her hadn't vanished, but it had changed its shape. It was no longer the sharp, anxious fear for a victim, but a quiet, hopeful confidence in a survivor. Sophie and I fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Our days were measured by the sun and the seasons, not by the ticking of a clock or the demands of others. We worked in our small garden, our hands in the dirt, coaxing life from the soil. We took long walks in the woods, identifying trees and birds, collecting pine cones and interesting stones. We were building a life here, a small, quiet fortress of peace, brick by brick, day by day. The call that truly signaled the turning of the tide came on a crisp autumn morning a few weeks later. The leaves on the trees surrounding the cottage had turned to brilliant shades of red and gold, and the air had a clean, sharp bite to it. I was on the porch with Sophie, teaching her how to knit, our needles clicking in a comfortable rhythm. When the phone rang, I felt no apprehension, only a calm curiosity. It was Ava. "Mom," she said, and her voice was clear, steady, and completely devoid of the fear that had haunted it for so long. "I did it. I told them to leave." I put down my knitting needles, my heart swelling with a fierce, quiet pride. I didn't speak, letting her have the space to tell her story in her own way. "It happened last night. she began. Ethan and I had a long talk for the first time. He actually listened, I think. I think seeing me stand up to him, seeing me take Sophie, seeing the video, it finally broke through his pride. He saw what his choices were costing him, what we were losing. She told me that she had laid out her terms, not as a request, but as a non-negotiable condition for her to even consider rebuilding their marriage. Her first and most important condition was that his parents had to go. We told them together, Ava said, a note of wonder in her voice. Ethan stood by me. He held my hand. He told his parents that this was his family, his home, and that their presence was destroying it. He told them they had a week to make other arrangements. The scene she described was one I could scarcely imagine. Richard, for once, was speechless, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. Brenda, predictably, burst into tears, launching into a tirade about their sacrifice, their ungrateful son, the daughter-in-law who had poisoned him against them. But this time, I didn't back down, Ava said, her voice firm. I looked her right in the eye and I said, Brenda, the only poison in this house was the disrespect you showed my mother and the cruelty you showed my children. This is not a negotiation. You will leave. And Mom, she had nothing to say. She just stared at me, and all the fight went out of her. I closed my eyes, picturing my daughter, no longer a ghost in her own home, but its fierce protector. She had found her voice, and it was powerful. I'm sorry, Mom, Ava continued, her voice softening, cracking with an emotion she had held back for years. I'm so sorry for being weak, for being a coward, for letting you take the blame, for letting you be treated that way in my home. I was so afraid of his anger, so afraid of being alone, that I sacrificed you. I will never forgive myself for that. The apology was a raw, painful, beautiful thing. It was everything I had ever needed to hear, and yet, in that moment, I realized it was no longer about me. It was about her. It was about her freeing herself from the weight of her own guilt. Ava, I said, my own voice thick with emotion. There is nothing to forgive. You are in an impossible situation, but you found your way out. That's all that matters. I paused, then added the most important words I could offer. That was your decision, Ava, your choice. You are so much stronger than you think you are. I was no longer the fixer. I was a witness to her strength, and in that moment, I consciously and completely handed her back the power over her own life. We were not just mother and daughter anymore. We were two women, standing on our own 2 feet. The months that followed were a time of quiet, steady rebuilding, both at the cottage and, from what I gathered, in the house in Charlotte. Winter settled over the mountains, blanketing our small world in a soft, silent layer of snow. Sophie and I spent our days by the fire, reading, knitting, and talking. She was thriving, her schoolwork done remotely with Ava's consent and the school's approval, her spirit bright and unburdened, to keep things simple. Ava sent me a brief notarized letter authorizing me to handle school and medical matters while Sophie stayed with me. The seasons turned, and with the first thaw of spring, we began planning our garden in earnest, poring over the old gardening journal, our shared project a symbol of the new life we were cultivating. Ava and Noah came to visit for a weekend in early summer. It was the first time I had seen Ava since that fleeting, desperate moment in the driveway. The change in her was remarkable. The slump in her shoulders was gone, replaced by a straight, confident posture. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a clear, steady gaze. She was still thin, still carried a certain weariness, but it was the weariness of a fighter, not a victim. She told me that Richard and Brenda were gone, having moved into a small retirement community an hour away. The day they left was strange, she added, her voice dropping. It wasn't a big dramatic exit. It was quiet and full of little barbs. Brenda left a parting gift on the kitchen counter for me. It was a book on home organization, and Richard didn't say goodbye at all. He just loaded the last box into his car and stared at the house for a long moment, then drove away. It was like they were trying to have the last word, even in their defeat. She also told me that she and Ethan were in therapy. It's hard, Mom, she admitted one evening as we sat on the porch after the children were asleep. There's a lot of damage to undo. Some days, I'm not sure we can. But he's trying for the first time. He's actually trying. He's learning to listen, and I'm learning that my voice matters. She spoke of it not as a magical cure, but as hard. painful work, and I knew that was a sign of true progress. The final afternoon of their visit, we all walked down to the lake. Noah, now a confident 4-year-old, chased butterflies, his laughter echoing in the clear mountain air. At one point, he ventured down to the water's edge by himself, crouching to watch a frog, something he never would have done a year ago. He would have been clinging to Ava's leg, terrified of being more than an arm's length away. Ava caught my eye, a real genuine smile on her face. "Look at him," she mouthed, her eyes shining. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes about the healing that had taken place. Sophie sat on the dock next to me, her feet dangling in the cool water, her head resting comfortably on my shoulder. The sun was warm on my face, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. The world felt perfectly, peacefully in balance. Later that evening, after they had gone, I was tidying up the living room. I picked up the old gardening journal and, as I did, a folded document slipped out from between the pages. It was the deed to the cottage, along with the trust documents for the Oak Hill Family Trust. I sat down in the armchair, the papers spread across my lap, the firelight flickering over the dense legal text and Arthur's familiar, strong signature. I looked at the documents, not as the weapons they had briefly become, but as what they truly were: a legacy. It was a legacy of love, of a husband's foresight and his fierce desire to protect his family. The power had never been in the paper itself, or in the leverage it provided. The power had been in my willingness to finally value myself enough to use it. It was the culmination of a lifetime of quiet compromises, ending in one definitive act of self-worth. I thought of the woman I had been less than a year ago, a ghost in someone else's home, a silent cog in a machine that was slowly grinding her away. That woman was gone. In her place was a woman who owned her own home, who managed her own finances, who had built a new life from the ashes of the old one. I was not a victim who had escaped. I was a woman who had finally, after a long and weary journey, come home to what was mine. I looked out the window at the moon rising over the lake, its silvery light bathing my small, quiet kingdom in a peaceful glow. I had reclaimed everything I owned, not just the house and the trust, but my dignity, my peace, and myself. And I had done it on my own terms.